The highest grossing films in cinema history, adjusted for inflation, are movies like Gone with the Wind, Avatar, Titanic, Star Wars, and Avengers Endgame. Grossing billions, these are the kings of the box office, and they do sort of prove that it takes money to make money. Even the cheaper ones required in the ballpark of 9 figures to produce. These are the blue chips, which also is why there's some amount of schadenfreude by the public to see one of them fail, like The Lone Ranger, which is estimated to have cost Disney $250 million. But what if you want to make it big in movies without a huge bankroll? What movies have the highest return on investment in Hollywood history? Then you're working with a different set of rules. Check out this top list. Paranormal Activity brought in $200 million with a budget of just $15,000. The Blair Witch Project made $250 million for $60. With a few notable exceptions, Mad Max and the very out of left field Deep Throat, scaring people seems to be the best way to hit a 100-bagger with a movie. The formula was first proven in 1974 by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You could argue that Paranormal Activity, Halloween, and the Blair Witch Project only got made because of its success. But then, if it was such a success, why didn't the movie make everyone involved rich? Well, here's the thing. The line from Texas Chainsaw Massacre to the other horror movies might be more obvious, but it's the line between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Deep Throat that made all the difference. The idea for Texas Chainsaw Massacre came to Tobe Hooper as he stood in an overcrowded department store and found himself staring at a rack of chainsaws, realizing he knew exactly how he could clear a path to get where he wanted to go. He got together with co-creator Kim Henkel and began work on the concept, which, in short, became a movie about a day where a family of cannibals dismember a bunch of unlucky kids. They formed the entity Vortex Inc., under which they housed their ownership rights. Then, to fund the operations of the filming, they sought to sell off 50% of the picture. Henkel described the situation by saying, quote, "We were going out on our hands and knees begging for money." Eventually, though, thanks to a connection by Hooper, the duo was able to raise $60,000. The biggest part of it, $40,000, came from the Vice President of Financial Affairs at Texas Tech, Bill Parsley, who was so enthusiastic about the project that he turned his lawyer from assuming that it was a guaranteed money-losing tax write-off, at the time it was called Cheesehead, to a co-investor. $10,000 also came from a man named Richard Sainez, allegedly a marijuana smuggler who owned a house equipped with an escape tunnel system. This was a lot of money for Henkel and Hooper to work with. Hooper had previously pulled off making a movie for $40,000. At the same time, $60,000 was clearly not enough money to make this movie. Even with cast and crew receiving as little as $50 to $125 up front, plus another $125 in deferred payments, with rights to percentage points of the movie's profits to sweeten the pot, everyone was forced to work extremely long days in extremely high Texas temperatures due to constraints on the filming timeline. The heat rotted the meat used in scenery, and people were throwing up between takes. As one actor described it, quote, "It was 105 or 110 degrees every day with 98% humidity, blazing sun, bugs, mosquitoes, ants, poor working conditions, one toilet for 40 people, maybe a dozen workers doing the job of a 50-person crew. One day, we shot for 22 hours straight with only one meal." Oh, and also, at the time, they didn't yet realize that the percentage of profits that had been promised were based only on Vortex's 50% ownership. So any potential payout was half of what they thought. Henkel and Hooper survived filming and got the footage they needed. They were out of money, though, and hours of unedited video is not a movie. To fund their editing process, they set out to sell an additional 19% of Vortex. The logical buyer was the Texas Tech VP who helped him out originally, but he decided that he wouldn't come to their rescue, allegedly telling them that if the movie failed at this point, he could end up owning the whole thing for free. Maybe not surprisingly, McCullough, the company responsible for the manufacturing of the chainsaw used in the movie, turned down a sponsorship opportunity. This time, it was Henkel who had the connections to save the endeavor. He had a writer friend who knew a lawyer who knew a bunch of other lawyers from a poker game. The duo screened 10 minutes of what they had and came out with $23,000 for the 19% that they'd been shopping, enough to edit the footage into a film. When all was said and done, between investors, actors, and crew taking their cut, Henkel and Hooper survived with 7.5% of the movie each. Seemingly, one of the only people that didn't get a cut was John LaRoquette, who provided the famous voiceover that opens the movie.
For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare.
He was paid in drugs. But of course, the points only matter if there is money, so for a while, you could have argued that LaRoquette was the smart one. A movie can't make money if nobody sees it, so filmmakers needed to team up with distributors to get their product into theaters and market it to the public. The Chainsaw crew thought that they had a deal done with heavyweight Columbia Pictures, only to have it revoked when upper management got a whiff of the type of movie that they were about to tie their brand to. With no other big studios showing any interest, they ended up with lesser-known Bryanston Distributors. The deal delivered $225,000 to Henkel Hooper and their investors and crew up front, plus it would send them 35% of the profits. The cash payment alone more than covered the investors' initial investment, so they were now on a free roll, but everyone else wasn't quite as stoked. After the investors and lawyers, bankers, etc. were all done getting their piece, there was only about $8,000 to divide among the 20 people with stakes in the movie. Of course, they still had the distributions that would be coming from the 35% of the profits, right? Here's what one of the men who negotiated the deal with Bryanston said about it years later. "We made a deal with the devil, and I guess that, in a way, we got what we deserved." Let's back up a little bit. In 1972, the movie Deep Throat came out and was a cultural sensation for more or less passing off hardcore sex as a feature film. It literally ran afoul of the law for distributing pornography across state lines, but it also made a ton of money, and that money went straight to the American mafia. They had financed the movie, forced the director to give up his share of profits to them, and then threatened theater owners to get even more of the pie. After the movie had run its course in theaters, one of the things that the profits were reinvested in was a film studio. Bryanston was run by the Perino brothers, associates of the Colombo crime family. It was a legitimate distribution company in that they had hired film industry veterans to assist with operations. They could hype a movie and get it shows in theaters across the country. They did this incredibly successfully with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They played both sides, getting positive reviews from the intellectual class and then using that to enrage the masses and the more conservative types. If politicians hated it, then other people needed to see it. They pulled stunts like donating a copy to the New York Museum of Modern Art so that they could advertise it as being part of MoMA's permanent collection. In the movie's first 4 days, limited release, papers announced it had done $602,000 in sales. Estimates of its total box office put the initial release around $20 million. But when Bryanston sent the first check for what they said was 35% of the profits, it was for less than $6,000. One actor with a fraction of a point of Chainsaw's box office said he'd been expecting a check between $1,000 and $2,000 and ended up with one for $28,000. Bryanston, it turned out, was legitimate in terms of its distribution, but mafia through and through with its accounting. Estimates of what a legitimate cut of $20 million in box office should have brought in put the low end at $2 million. Total payouts ever received from Bryanston were just over $100,000. Henkel, Hooper, cast, and crew first tried hiring an auditor, but he got nowhere. Part of the problem undoubtedly was that the mafia connection of Bryanston was well established. It felt dangerous, and it didn't help that another movie they helped distribute, Return of the Dragon, had starred Bruce Lee, who had then died under suspicious circumstances, allegedly with Bryanston owing him millions of dollars. The money involved was enough to convince everyone to keep trying, though. They got a lawyer, one of the poker crew gang who had a stake in the movie, to sue. One of Chainsaw's actors claimed that the lawyer had prepped for his confrontation in part by reading The Godfather. The meetings between the parties went about as well as you'd expect, with Lou Perino reportedly telling the Texans, quote, "You don't have enough balls to sue me." He was wrong, though. They brought suit in 1976, and eventually settled for $400,000 in the return of the rights of the film. But even this was a lie. Bryanston had sold its claim to the movie throughout the world to all sorts of smaller distributors, and many of those companies had also been screwed out of what they thought was their share of profits, and they wouldn't give up what they believed was their rights. The Texans struggled to enforce anything. The $400,000 never appeared. Bryanston had bankrupted itself, funding other unsuccessful movies, and more importantly, trying and eventually failing to fend off a federal obscenity charge against Lou Perino for the distribution of Deep Throat. Some of the distributors who had bought parts of the movie seemed to be worse than simple bystanders. Somehow, after seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacre distributed in 85 countries, the amount of money that made it to the Texans was under $20,000 in total, despite reports like one about how on opening night in London, that was the take for one single theater. All the while, Lou Perino was almost certainly raking in cash as, unbeknownst to the gang, at least at first, one of the major, smaller distributors was a subsidiary of Bryanston set up just before it collapsed. There were many battles to be fought in the courts, and they took a long time to fight. At one point, Bill Paisley, the Texas Tech guy, and the lawyer who went up against Perino for the Texans found themselves in a suit against Henkel and Hooper, claiming they controlled the film and the rights to sequels. Later distribution deals made in the 80s started bringing in more significant cash. Plus, doors were open. Some found success on the other side, others, not so much. Kim Henkel found himself more so on the side of not so much. His filmography is mostly a slew of sequels and homages to the movie that made him famous, if not rich. He summarized the lesson he learned along the way to a reporter in the mid-80s, remarking, "Anybody can cheat you anytime in this business, and from what I've learned, I always figure they're going to." Thanks for watching, guys.